This is part 9 of the Craftsman King Seeley 100 Drill Press Rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 8, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we're going to begin the assembly by assembling a lot of the sub-assemblies. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. First thing we're going to be working on is the assembly of the power panel that I fabricated. And in this power panel, we're going to insert the receptacle. And this is where the motor will plug into the power panel. And then we've got the power cord. And for that, I'm going to need to strip the shielding off of it and get those 3 wires exposed. Once I've got enough of that exposed, probably about 8 inches, 6 to 8 inches, somewhere in there, we can cut away that shielding, test fit the grommet, and then go ahead and insert the grommet into the power panel. Then we can run the power cord through it. And at some point I may do just a separate video on how to make one of these so that all the wire connections make sense, but I'll probably breeze through it here. So I'm installing a hog ring, which acts as a wire stress relief so that you don't pull the cable back out of that grommet once that hog ring is on there. And then we're going to begin to connect some of the wires. So I'm connecting all of the grounds right now, which we have a ground from the receptacle, and for some reason it's yellow. We've got a ground coming from the power cable that's green, and then we've got 1 extra green wire that's coming off of there. We'll go ahead and connect that terminal on there. And that leftover green wire is what we're going to ground to the power panel itself. We'll be using the same screw that we're going to use to mount the light socket. And once we've got that on there, next we're going to connect a longer lead from the neutral on the power cord, and that will run to the switch. And then we'll put a blade connector on it and then plug it into the switch. Then we'll connect another lead to the neutral coming off of the light socket. And then we connect all of the hots together. And that last lead will go to the switch as well. And that completes the circuit. When we throw the switch, it will put power to the light socket and the receptacle for the motor. So what we've got left to do is connect the ground to that screw. And then this entire power panel is grounded to the head with the 2 screws that I used to mount it. So the last thing we need to do is just tidy up some of these cables with the zip tie. And then we can test it. So we'll put a light bulb in the light socket, and I'll plug in my heat gun to where the motor would go. And we've already got this plugged in. The power panel is plugged in to that strip under my table. So we'll make sure it's turned on and then put power to it, and the heat gun is running and the light switch or the light bulb is obviously working. I'm just going to make sure it's grounding properly, and then make sure the switch turns everything off, and then we can set the power panel to the side. Next thing we're going to do is assemble the motor mount. So if you recall, I'm using a motor mount off of a 150 machine because it's a tilting motor mount. So it has the mounting rods that connect to the motor mount plate with these roll pins. So use a 1/4 inch punch to just make sure all that's lined up. And then we'll use needle nose pliers to drop that roll pin in there, and then a small brass hammer to get it started. That's me talking to somebody. And then once we've got it started, we can go ahead and finish seating that roll pin. Make sure it's protruding through the other side. And then we just flip this over and do the same thing for the other motor mount rod. Make sure it's lined up. And then insert the roll pin, get it started, and then make sure it's seated properly. And it wasn't all the way down, so there we go. And the last thing we're going to do with the motor mount plate is add a screw on the bottom where that hole is there. So this is a 1/4 inch screw, and I've just got nuts on each side of it so I can adjust its distance from the head. And then I'm going to put a rubber bumper on there. So the next thing we're working on is installing the panels. So this is the engine turned headband panel, and we're just installing it on the head unit. It uses drive screws, and I think these are number 6 drive screws. I don't remember. They come in a variety of sizes from McMaster Car. And I slipped with the brass, but that's why we use brass. And then we can, once we've got that one started, we'll get the other side started. We just need to get it lined up. And there we go. So now we can drive this home. Fully seat that drive screw, and then make sure that all the slack is taken out of that headband. The holes that these drive screws sit inside the headband are kind of elongated, so there's a little bit of play there. So I'm just taking up that play, and then we'll seat it. Try to figure out how I'm going to hold the headband in place and the brass punch at the same time. And there we go. So next we've got the Craftsman logo panel that goes above that headband. And I didn't realize that the camera was looking so far down. Sorry about that, but you can still make it out. So again, it gets attached with drive screws as well. We'll start one side and then put the other drive screw in, and then we'll finish it off. Like a boss. So the next thing we're going to do is install the model number data panel on the base. And I had these made up by my friend Matt Blast over on Garage Journal, because the original was in really bad shape. And then we'll seat those two drive screws. And we're done. So next we're going to go ahead and assemble the spindle pulley assembly. And I'll be installing some brand new Timken 6205 ball bearings. And we'll drop that first bearing on there. And then use the spacer to pop that bearing down a little bit further, see if it'll go. If not, then we've got a piece of PVC pipe that is hitting on the inner race of that bearing, so it's not hitting on the shielding. Once we've got that bearing seated, we can drop the spacer on there, and then the second bearing, which went on stupid easy. And then we've got the inner snap ring that holds all of that together on that shaft. We're just going to make sure that it's retaining those bearings very good. We'll go ahead and use a Q-tip and lube the inside where the splines meet the splines on the spindle. And this is super lube. And all the lubing we're going to be doing, well, most of the lubing we're going to be doing is with that super lube. So if you recall, I went ahead and modified the Quill to accept a retaining ring. So I'm going to go ahead and install that retaining ring on the Quill. And here we have the pinion and the hub and the spring assembly. So on the pinion and the hub, the pin that goes in there that holds all this together has splines on one end of it. And if you look at the holes that it's going to go in, you can see that one side of that hub should be splined. The other side should not. So we're going to drive it in so that the splines match. So once we've got the pinion and the hub lined up, then we can install the spring. And I'm just going to use that punch to line up the loop in the spring with the hole for the pin. And then we can drop the pin in there, and the splines are facing up right now. So once we seat it, should be good to go. Like so. Continuing with the hub pinion spring assembly, we have the feed handle rods and the feed handle knobs. So we'll just thread all those on there. And then we can set that entire assembly to the side. And next we've got the Quill spindle assembly. And here I'll be installing some brand new Nachi 6202 ball bearings, and these are special. They have a 5/8 bore. So if you're doing this, make sure that you get 6202s with 5/8 bore. If you don't have the 5/8 bore, because that bearing normally has a 17 millimeter bore. So if you're not using the special bore, the 5/8 bore, you're going to have a devil of a time getting it on that spindle. So my PVC pipe is going to smack the shielding on that bearing. So I've got a washer that will rest on the inner race, and that way we're not damaging the bearing. And then we can seat that first bearing. Pull that washer out of there. That's actually the spacer that is part of this assembly. But the next thing is the quill itself, and just make sure that the rack is on there properly and that retaining ring is at the bottom. And then we can hold it together and seat the second bearing and slide it into the quill. Like so. And then we've got the shim. It's like a metal washer that goes there. And then we've got the rubber washer. And then we've got the spindle collar. And that has a cone point set screw that has a specific area that's been milled out of the spindle that it needs to ride in. And the curved part of that collar faces up. Then we're going to compress it with my thumb and then tighten down that cone point set screw. And you can use Loctite on that set screw if you need to. I don't really have a need to do it, but yeah, it is what it is. Next thing we're going to do is we're just going to install the feed stop bracket on the bottom of the quill. We're just going to slide it on there for now. And it has to be on there before we install the chuck. Otherwise, you'll have to take the chuck back off to get it on there. So next, we're just going to put a large Allen wrench inside the chuck and make sure that the flats on the Allen wrench line up with the flats on the jaws for the chuck. Then we'll head over to the vise and clamp that Allen wrench down in the vise. Then we're going to use some acetone and we're going to clean the taper on the spindle. And then we'll clean the socket that's in the chuck. We're not going to put any lubricant on there. We're not going to put any type of bonding compound or anything like that. This is a dry fit. So next we're just going to install the taper into the socket and then tighten down the safety collar on the chuck. And then we'll use a spanner wrench to fully seat it. And I'll put a link here for my chuck omnibus video, which shows how to install and remove and disassemble and reassemble the Jacobs chuck, in case you have any questions about that. So then we can pop it back out of the vise and go ahead and remove that Allen wrench out of the chuck. And I'm going to go ahead and retract the jaws so they don't get damaged. And then we're going to go ahead and slide the Quill bumper down on the quill. And then we can install the hardware for the quill stop bracket. So I'm just going to hand tighten it. I'm not going to tighten it down yet because we're going to line that up when we install the spindle quill assembly in the head casting. But it has a screw and a lock washer and a nut. So next we're going to go ahead and assemble the table support. And the first thing we're going to do there is install the protractor. And I'm just going to eyeball it, and then once we're done installing the table and everything on the drill press, then we can come back and adjust that protractor if we need to. But it has a small screw that just sits in the center of it, and you tighten it down. There's a little bit of paint on the inside of that screw hole, so that screw was giving me a hard time there, and no big deal. We'll just tighten it down. And we'll set it aside. Next, we're going to go ahead and install the motor on the motor mount. And I like to install the motor bolts on the 150 mount as low as I can get them. So I'm pushing the mount up and getting the motor as low as possible. But there's 4 bolts, and each bolt will get a washer and then a nut. And here I'm using the original bolts and nuts and washers. I ended up changing those out with some newer hardware, but I didn't capture all that on video. No big deal. It's the same thing. I just liked using the newer stuff. And here I've got the motor pulley, and I've got to use a shim or a coupler, and that coupler has to be modified for the set screws. So I didn't have that on camera either, and I apologize. As you can see in the top right corner, the motor pulley is already on the motor at this point. So here we've got the base, and we're just going to lube all 3 of those bores that the column sits in. And we're using Super Lube again. And then we've got the column lock screw that I'm going to go ahead and lube it up as well. Since this sits on the floor, this is one of the things that gets rusty really fast. And I've had many drill presses that I had a real hard time getting the column out of the base. So here I'm lubing up the base column lock shoe. It's just a piece of cast iron. It sits in that little protrusion on the back of that bore, like so. And then we can go ahead and install the column. So I'll go ahead and seat the column all the way to the floor, and then I'm going to come back and lift the column up about 1/8 of an inch so that it's resting in that bottom bore and not on the floor itself. And once I've got it where I want it, then I'm going to tighten it down. like so. And next we'll go ahead and lube up the table support. So we'll lube both of those bores, and then the bores for the actual lock itself. And then we'll lube up the table lock. So the screw, which is the handle, and the sleeve, and then the nut, and then we'll install the table support and lock it down. And that is going to wrap up this video. So in the next video, we will complete the assembly of this drill press. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you got any questions, post them in the comments section. As always, I appreciate everybody's support. This has been a fun drill press to work on, and I will see you next time.